Yeah, we would just like to welcome everyone to this webinar on plants and plant agency. And all the panelists in this webinar are here because they have contributed to this anthology on plants in children's and young adult literature, which has been edited by Melanie Duckworth and myself, Lykke Guanio-Uluru. And I would just like all the panelists maybe to present themselves, say their names and affiliations, so we can see everyone.
Hi, I'm Terri Doughty. I'm from Vancouver Island University in Canada.
Hi, my name is Mónika Rusvai. I'm from Hungary, from the University of Szeged. Hello to all, welcome to this panel.
And hello, my name is Justyna Deszcz-Tryhubczak, and I'm from the University of Wrocław in Poland.
Hello, and I'm Anja Höing from the University of Osnabrück in Germany.
Hi, I'm Melanie Duckworth. I'm from Østfold University College in Norway. Currently, I'm in Australia. I'm a visiting researcher at the University of Adelaide in South Australia.
Yeah, and this as a way of introduction, because we're in this very interesting climate lit context. We all know that the significance of plants to the global climate is increasingly a topic in the discussion of climate change as well. And we have been particularly interested in plants. You all know that people talk about ecosystem services of plants, particularly trees, perhaps. Like humans, plants are increasingly under different kinds of pressure from pesticides, trade interests, shifting temperatures, and genetic engineering. So one of the things that is discussed within the subject field of climate plant studies is whether we are at liberty to use and shape plants to our own ends. Because recent botanical research focusing on plant capabilities has led to a re-examination and re-evaluation of the roles played by plants in philosophy, literature, and art. We have been asking questions like, are plants intelligent? What types of agencies do plants have? How do we represent plants in science and art? And should we think of plants as people? And even if we do not, do plants have rights? In terms of the structure, we would like to start by giving you a taste of our different contributions in plants in children's and young adult literature. And after that, we will open the panel to questions and comments, and hopefully we will have an interesting discussion. So the first section of our book is entitled Botanical Fascination. It comprises chapters which engage with plant botany and the philosophical distinction between plants and other species. So I think I will just pass the word to you, Terri, and you can tell us a little bit more about your chapter.
Thank you, Lykke. And I thank you and Melanie for your creation and guidance of this so interesting project. I also need to do a couple of other acknowledgements. I acknowledge a grant from my university that allowed me to study at the Swedish Institute for Children's Books, which has led to some of this research, some of this chapter. And I also want to acknowledge that I wrote this chapter on the traditional unceded territories of the Snuneymuxw people. So the texts that I discuss, as you can see, look a bit retro, they're older. And for many people, these are not really what one considers climate literature, but I think they're still useful to look at and instructive as exemplars of plant-human interactions. I became interested in the topic when I first encountered the work of Elsa Beskow, I was very familiar with the intersection of flowers, children, and fairies in the Anglosphere tradition, exemplified by Cicely Mary Barker here. But I found Beskow's books very different. She was writing in the same period, roughly as Barker, but at the same time, her books have a much stronger focus on relationality. And I started reading to try to find some theoretical framework to articulate what I was sensing when I read the books. So I read Donna Haraway, Africa Taylor, Karen Malone, and others. And what I found really best explaining what I see in Beskow's work is multi-species entanglement. And so I begin my chapter by talking about plant blindness, humans' inability to see plants as anything other than background. Barker's books, with their use of fairies to ventriloquize plant identity and concerns, function dominantly to combat plant blindness. There's an overtly educational element to these books that facilitate plant identification and impart plant knowledge. Comprised of individual poems and paintings for each plant, these books do not lend themselves overly to reimagining plant-human interactions as entanglements. In Beskow's books, however, which present narratives, we find decentered human children learning to see plants, to engage with plants, and to recognize that, to borrow Matthew Hall's phrasing, plants are persons. Beskow's plant-human hybrids exist within complex webs of relationship among different species of plants, insects, birds, amphibians, and yes, even humans. In the illustration I've included from Christopher's Garden, you can see a mix of plants that are useful to humans and not particularly useful. You see the human child is not at the center. The person playing the lute is actually an avatar of the month September. And so what you see is a kind of gathering where there's no apparent hierarchy that places humans at the top. Lately, I've been reading more in Indigenous science, and I have been struck by botanist Robin Wall-Kimmerer's application of Gary Nabhan's statement that there can be no environmental restoration without restoration. Some might dismiss works like Barker's or Beskow's coming from the early 20th century as quaint or lacking relevance in our current moment of climate crisis. However, if we seek to generate an effective cognitive shift to transform human understanding of our place amongst our fellow more than human beings on this earth that we all share, we may find new old stories provide necessary imaginaries to guide us. Thank you.
Thanks, Terri. That was great. This second section of our book is entitled Fantasy and Folklore, which focuses on magical and animated plants in fantasy and myth. And so representing this section of the book, I'll pass on to Mónika.
Thank you, Melanie. And thank you for putting this very interesting volume together. I was really happy to engage on working on it. And I have to admit that my relationship to nature and plants is twofold, because on the one hand, it is included in my research topic as a PhD student. And I'm also a fantasy author writing in Hungarian. And I'm also very much interested in plant-human relationships in my writing as well. So the title of my chapter is Vegetal Magic, Agnieszka's Journey to the Understanding of the Vegetal Other in Naomi Novik's Uprooted. What you see on the picture is the Hungarian cover of Uprooted. I found this version of the cover because it was so intricate with these tree branches intertwining everything on the picture. The methods of facing the other play a key role in handling the global climate crisis. whilst climate fiction for young adults generally deals with how we might face the consequences of our mistreatment of nature, fantasy may enable us to take a step further backwards, and it aids us in the conscious revision of our relationship with nature. In our global capitalist reality, nature is most commonly seen and pictured on anthropocentric terms. However, fantasy literature is able to challenge this anthropocentric attitude. This is exactly what happens in Naomi Novik's young adult fantasy novel, Uprooted. Novik problematizes the vegetal through a terrifying magical wood where trees capture villagers and consume them, while the poor victims' agonized faces remain visible through tree bark. The protagonist, Agnieszka, is a village girl living near the wood who is chosen to become the local magician's apprentice. She is expected to learn a state-legitimized, highly anthropocentric form of magic. Agnieszka is unable to internalize this perspective and begins to work out her own magic that relies on solidarity with the non-human, that is the vegetal and the wood. In the chapter, I argue that through her discovery of a different magic, Agnieszka manages to blur the boundary between the human and the vegetal, and thus she reinforces the interrelatedness of the two. Lastly, I would like to share some details with you about the ways how the titular vegetal magic, the key tool to our relationship with nature, is achieved in this novel. So firstly, to obtain vegetal magic, Agnieszka has to challenge an established system of knowledge and evidently rewrite its rules. Secondly, this entails a non-rational, almost artistic modification of language. In the novel, obviously, it is the language of spells that she uses. And thirdly, this new form of language consciously deconstructs previous anthropocentric semiotics. So all three are worth considering not only when fighting against a seemingly ruthless magical wood, but also when we have to face the consequences of our previous misunderstanding of the natural other, and to think about these when we want to re-establish and reconstruct our relationship to nature. Thank you.
Yeah, I just realized I forgot to say how much we enjoyed working on this book, right, Melanie? And that we actually have chapters by 16 different authors from 11 different countries. So it's quite a broad international scope to the texts. Yeah, and it was very interesting to have this view from all of these different locations and spaces and different authors. And the most voluminous section of the book is termed Boreal Embraces, and this reflects the long-standing human interrelationships with trees and forests. And this section focuses on tree relationships, so we will hear from Melanie and then from Justyna.
Okay, thank you. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that today I'm speaking from Ghana country in South Australia, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands here and the elders past and present and emerging. Okay, so my chapter is called Arboreal and Maternal Desires, Trees and Mothers in Recent Australian Middle Grade Fiction. This chapter examines the representation and conflation of trees and mothers in 3 recent Australian middle grade novels: Martina Murray's Molly and Pym and the Millions of Stars, The Mulberry Tree by Alison Rusby, and How to Be by Bren McDibble. In Molly and Pym, Molly's mother literally becomes a tree, and in the mulberry tree, an ancient tree's grief over the loss of her daughter prompts her to prey upon the human daughters of the village. In McDibble's dystopian How to Be, where children work as bees to pollinate trees in a world where wild bees are extinct, trees provide refuge to Peony, who is threatened by her mother's reliance on the city and an abusive relationship. These books were chosen as they each both invoke and trouble the trope of mother as tree, nurturing and self-sacrificial, that has been embodied disturbingly in Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree. The various constellations of tree, mother, child relationships in these novels interrogate themes of kinship, nurture, and maternal desire. What does it mean to think of a mother as a tree or a tree as a mother? Trees and mothers tend to be regarded in the context of what they can provide for others. Trees provide shade, fruit, and wood for fuel and shelter, while motherhood is often understood as abrogating one's own desires in favour of the needs of one's offspring. The desires of trees and mothers are less frequently considered. I found that these novels present the relationship between mothers and trees differently. While Molly and Pym directly overlays the image of the caring mother with a fruitful tree, and How to Be questions the natural association of the mother and the tree. The mulberry tree imputes fierce and dangerous maternal desires to a tree itself. While this does not reveal anything new about what could really be considered arboreal desire, it does raise the prospect of a tree as a desiring being. In the other two novels, the desires of trees for earth, sky, bees, and rain are quietly expressed. As the title of How to Be indicates, the novels propose a different way of being in the world, alert to the desires of plants as well as our own. And so now I'll hand over to Justyna.
Thank you very much, Lykke and Melanie, for bringing us together and for all your work on this wonderful collection of essays. So together with Charlotte van Bergen, who is an independent scholar based in the Netherlands, we are authors of Chapter 8, Arboreal Entanglements, Children, Forest and Deforestation in Eco-Poetry by Children. And in the chapter, we rely on the concept of children forests to address entanglements of children and forests as we reflect on 29 eco-poems about deforestation written in 2018 by pupils of John Clare Primary School in the village of Helpston in the UK. Children forest is an element of childhood nature, a continuum of mutually shaping and multidirectional connectivities of children and nature involving humans and other kinds of beings and agencies. Children, just like adults, are nature because they always already belong to modern human collectivities. And I think that, well, at this point, I would also like to stress, I think the absolute necessity that we as scholars and of course other scholars working on childhood, broadly speaking, this necessity to address, I think, the kinds of children of childhood nature that is emerging at the moment in Ukraine. Childhood nature, itself is a sphere of nature cultures, a concept developed by Donna Haraway, a concept which collapses the social biological divide and highlights the messy co-mattering and inseparability of nature and culture. As childhood nature manifests itself in diverse practices, we acknowledge children's literature and culture, which for us includes child-authored texts, as belonging to it. And we see the poems we discuss as co-constituting a particular children forest through representations of trees' lives and the interspecies communities in which these trees participate. In all the poems, the lyrical subject is a tree pondering the devastating results of deforestation, and some trees also contemplate their own death. we reflect on how the arboreal imaginaries created by the young authors rely on anthropomorphism to both confirm and challenge human domination over forests. And finally, and I think most productively for further research on children's culture of and in the Anthropocene, we think of children's culture as part of nature culture. And this is the idea that I have also been working on with Macarena Garcia-Gonzalez. We suggest that cultural texts and practices, regardless of who produces them and with whom they are meant to be shared, emerge from the ongoing commingling of human and non-human actors, the physical world, language, various forces and intensities, including a war, for example. And furthermore, texts of culture are not just expressions of human activity whose meaning awaits to be decoded by a human subject, but they rather gain and lose agency as a material force or a non-human actor. Creativity itself is not an inherently individual human property, but a process resulting from the mutual constitutiveness of multiple agencies in human and non-human entanglements, for example, involving children, forests, and trees, and other texts. And here, I think we are moving away from the developmental framework, which in turn opens the possibility of the child and adult as we-centered in a network of material semiotic relations without being denied their ability and right to express their own unique ideas, for instance, about climate crisis or plastic pollution or loss of biodiversity. And a number of questions, of course, emerge here, and I just mentioned a couple of them. So what does it take to develop an ethical sensibility to the flat ontology of relations among humans, texts, and forces, and the world, sorry? What epistemologies do we need to know these multiplicities, these movements? How are text and media material and agentic in children's and adults' entanglement with the world? And how do relational ontologies prompt us to rethink age categories and professional hierarchies? And I leave you with these questions for now, at least. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justyna. As you've probably noticed in listening to the short talks we've had so far, the concept of agency is really something that comes up again and again, the agency of plants, the agency of children in kind of these entanglements or in desires or in relationships. And so the final section of our book focused on this kind of even more intensely, and it is called Plant Agency and Activism, and it focuses on representations of the agency of plants and activism inspired by and even performed by plants. So we'll hear from Anja first and then from Lykke.
Hello. So my chapter in this book dealt with the representation of plant agency in 3 English language children's books published during the second decade of the 21st century. Kathleen Van Cleve's Drizzle from the US, and 2 British books, Frances Hardinge's The Light Tree, rather for a young adult audience, and Sophie Anderson's The Girl Who Speaks Bear, which is for a younger child audience. So to directly summarize my findings in a nutshell, one could say that I come to the conclusion ultimately that despite all these books basically engaging with climate-related issues, none of them could be confidently termed climate literature. So why is that? First of all, I said, okay, they do engage with such issues. So for example, in Drizzle, we have a girl who battles a local desertification and has to call rain. In The Light Tree, we have basically an age-old tree that fights for its survival in a changing world, in a very nasty way. And finally, in The Girl Who Speaks Bear, there's a girl who has to fight a vegetal fire dragon who devastates an entire forest. So climate change is an issue in all these books, but it is an issue in a rather weird way. I looked at these books in terms of basically 2 axes. One was how is vegetal agency represented on a scale of natural versus unnatural? And the second is how are ecosystems represented as static, as they very often are represented in children's literature, or as adaptive and changeable as they are in reality. And this is why basically I come to the conclusion that these representations are rather problematic, even though they all these books do acknowledge agency to plants. So first of all these stories basically misrepresent ecosystems, representing them as static. Basically, the idea is that once you will stop pushing an ecosystem, it will just revert back to its original natural state and all will be good again. So basically, they present easy solutions to a problem that obviously isn't that easy. Second is that even though all these books represent vegetal agency, they all situate that as something basically magical. So in Drizzle, the entire farm is magical. In the Light Tree, the vegetal agent, the Light Tree, is part of a vanishing system. So basically a representative of the very system the protagonist fights against. And finally, in The Girl Who Speaks Bear, we have a fairy tale underplot, you could say, intersecting with the main plot. And the plant is most agentic in these fairy tale stories. And the deeper you go into the main plot, the less agentic the plant becomes. So agency is again presented as something like the stuff of fairy tales. So a child reading these books can be confronted with a lot of vegetal agency and still in the end believe, okay, this is the stuff of magic, and can go out again and see the forest is nothing but setting, which it obviously is not. Final point is that even though all these stories are about agentic plants, they are also at the bottom still primarily about children growing up. So the plant is always kind of the sidekick. In the Light Tree, it's even the villain, while the main heroine is always a girl who has to find her place in the world, has to find her place in her peer group. So in a nutshell, you could say that these basically rather hope-inspiring books, because they do represent vegetal agency, still tell us that in order to really do something about climate change and to get our children to become activists against climate change, what we need in the long term is a significant shift in what is represented in children's literature. And this is my chapter in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Lykke now as the final chapter we talk about.
Yeah, so in my chapter, I've been interested in exploring the concept of vegetable violence in Andrew Griffiths and Terri Denton's The 52-Story Treehouse. And some of you may be familiar with this richly illustrated Australian book series, which has been criticized for its use of scatological humor, its irreverence for authority figures, and its perceived encouragement of young readers toward bad behavior. However, in the fourth volume of the series, Griffiths and Denton lead the reader through an ethical exploration of human relationships to plants, with an emphasis on vegetables. And the illustration that you can see here is part of the first stage of this exploration, which involves questions of plant capacities and plant rights. It introduces the character of Vegetable Patty, a violent woman who is on a vendetta against vegetables with an aim to eradicate them from the face of the earth. And as the protagonists, Andy and Terri, watch Patty's violent antics, they eventually start sympathizing with the vegetables, which they have previously admitted that they hate. So the reader is invited both by the illustrations, where the vegetables are anthropomorphized with faces, and by Andy and Terri's verbal statements to pity these plants. So in the first part, which introduces the idea that plants are worthy of consideration, this part casts the vegetables as victims. But later the story foregrounds the agency of plants, who are recast as villains when the protagonists discover that their friend and neighbor Jill has been pricked to sleep by a carrot, alluding to Sleeping Beauty, the fairy tale. And Jill is the animal whisperer in the series, who can talk to all kinds of animals and insects. But in spite of the protagonist's love for violent chainsaw juggling and shark tanks, actually the harming of animals is something of a taboo in the books. In the 52-story treehouse, it looks like this ethical consideration for other species is about to get extended to plants, but the narrative eventually pulls back from this ethical position. As Andy and Terri travel to the vegetable kingdom to find a prince who can kiss Jill awake, their relationship to vegetable undergoes a carnivalesque reversal. They don vegetable costumes to blend in, engaging in phytomorphism, but are discovered and thrown in the dungeons by violent vegetables. So here the vegetables are turned into monster plants, a trope suggestive of taxonomic unease in relation to species boundaries. As the protagonists are about to become human soup, Vegetable Patty comes to their rescue, silencing the vegetables once and for all. And this final silencing of the vegetables signals an ultimate reluctance to accept the proposition that plants have moral worth. But even so, I would say the vigorous, genteel vegetables in the 52-story treehouse managed to memorably disrupt the story universe, and might even sow a few seeds of phyto-awareness in the reader along the way. Yeah, so that was my chapter, and we've been through a few samples from the book. So I think we would like now to open the webinar to questions and answers. If I don't know if you have received any questions, or whether we should just discuss between ourselves. There's a question from Marek.
I need to unmute myself. I wasn't able to post a question in the Q&A for, I don't know why, but the question is this. In the books that you examined in your chapters, how is the question of plants' individuality versus collectivity examined? Like, how do authors treat plants as individuals, the way like individual persons, or are plants more projected as, I guess, collective forms of intelligence? Like, I'm very curious about the range of these different forms of representation that you saw. Thank you.
May I speak? Yeah. Okay. That is a really interesting question, Mark, because a lot of the science that Lykke referenced does talk about plants living not as living collectively, rather than as kind of collective or specimen types, I guess, with what we're learning about, things like mycelium, underground networks between plants and trees and such. But for the books that I look at, in the flower fairy books, the plants are kind of specimens. But in Beskow's books, the plants are part of communities, and they are anthropomorphized to some degree. I would argue that anthropomorphism is a necessary element in humans trying to kind of connect with plants, because they're otherwise, they're so alien to us in their biology, that and of course we have no kind of common language at this point. So I think, anthropomorphism is a way to try to connect a little bit. And the plants that Beskow describes they are in families. They're multi-generational families. They are extended families, webs of kinship. And they are given names that are kind of, species, Mrs. Cabbage or what have you. But they are very definitely, I think, presented as lively beings that live in constant entanglement with one another. And it's the children who become brought into that entanglement as the outsiders, as it were. So I don't know how much that answers your question, but it describes the books.
Yeah, I might just jump in as well, if that's okay. Or Anja, are you going to go? No, okay. Yeah, so thanks for that. Yeah, I just add, like in the books I looked at, there was kind of a contrast, especially in two of the books, The Mulberry Tree and Molly and Pim and the Millions of Stars. They both really focused on the idea of a tree as an individual, I suppose. So like in Molly and Pim, the mother actually transforms into a tree, so as a person who becomes a tree. So it is actually a person, it's actually a human, but it's a tree as well. And then in the Mulberry Tree, it turns out that's kind of this horror story of this very evil, scary tree that's kind of haunting and consuming characters in the village. It turns out the reason she's doing this tree is because hundreds of years ago, she had her own little daughter tree next to her, and the people who owned the house decided, oh, there's no room here for this little sapling, we're going to move it out into the park. And this tree is so furious and angry and devastated by her daughter being stolen from her that she then attacks the daughters of the people. So that's quite anthropomorphized as well, but it's thinking about the tree as a character with agency and emotion, I suppose, which I think was quite interesting. But I would just say as well that this kind of a Western concept of the tree as a kind of an individual is something that's also quite different often in Indigenous cultures. And I'm reading up on Aboriginal poetry about trees for a new project I'm working on at the moment, and quite often other trees in Australian Aboriginal works are presented more as kind of embodied in country, in the land, and in relationship with other plants and animals and people. So it's not the concept of an individual tree or by itself, it's the concept of it all being connected, I guess.
Perhaps to add one final voice to that question, because in my books, it's quite interesting that the one presenting the plant as most individualistic is the one actually presenting a crop. So that is the story Drizzle, where the girl makes friends with a rhubarb. And it's rhubarb on a rhubarb field, on a rhubarb plantation. And so she says stuff like, okay, he's in row 13, the 48th plant on the left. And my mother she never finds him. She doesn't realize that he's my friend and not the other rhubarbs, just him. So that's quite an interesting way of dealing with this individual plant. But still the farm is represented as a kind of ecosystem, and the plant also becomes a kind of voice for the entire system. So he can't speak, but he tries to communicate via letting his leaf hang, telling, okay, we need rain here, and speaks up for the plant or the farm as an ecosystem. And it's interestingly enough, it's different with my two books that deal with trees. There are individual trees there, but in The Girl Who Speaks Bear, that lime tree is basically just a representation of the soul of the forest. So it doesn't have a character, it's just the voice of the forest. While in the Lie tree, there's this one individual tree who's kind of, it's the last of its species. You get the feeling it's the last of its species. And if it wasn't that, there also wouldn't be a kind of individual character to that. It's just the plant fighting for its survival. So the most individualistic plant in these books I looked at is the crop plant.
If I may add just a little bit, as far as children's ideas about this individuality and collectivity are concerned, A lot reappears from what you already mentioned in the poems. Of course, the poems, like the format of the poem, and we have this lyrical eye as a tree, this already, of course, generates, right, a sense of individuality, this kind of directness with which each particular tree in the poem addresses the reader, and more generally, humans. There are quite a lot of direct addresses to those humans who come to the forest and destroy it. But the trees in the poems perceive themselves, very often they identify their own species, their own kind. They see themselves as part of bigger families of trees, and also as providing kind of, or being at least interconnected or entangled with other creatures, with animals. And they see the destruction of themselves and the forest in general as in this kind of broader ecological sense, as well as a destruction of the whole community. So there is also a lot of these ideas about interspecies connectivity, including humans as well. And there's a lot of this awareness in a way on the part of the trees that their death means also death of humans ultimately. Okay, so that's just from me. Thank you.
Monica, did you want to say anything?
Well, may I address one of the questions in the Q&A session, the one asking about whether anthropomorphism is wrong and how we should approach this? Because I think that the basic thing in this respect is that I was speaking about anthropocentrism, and we must differentiate between the two, because anthropocentrism is the way that we always thought of the human position. We sort of apply a human gaze on nature and we see or benefit from it. For instance, 2 years ago, I spent 6 weeks in Krakow, Poland, and I was watching the beautiful park around the city center. And there actually I saw some trees that were in the middle of the path, and the path was sort of winding its way around the tree. So, and I even posted a picture of that and saying that this is non-anthropocentric thinking, because they didn't only think of what the human objective would be, that the road should go straight on, but they circled around the tree because they knew that it was a huge tree and birds needed the tree and everything. So they could go beyond that. What about anthropomorphism? Anthropomorphism can become very useful because every person do feel that plants are quite far away from us in their bodily construction, in how they function in everyday life. But through anthropomorphism, they can be brought closer. And if you think about the terminology that we use even in critical plant studies, you see titles coming out such as the mind of plants. Do plants have intelligence? The language of plants. So we keep using these words, and I think that these do help us in establishing a relationship to nature. So I think that putting a human gaze, an anthropocentric gaze on plants is wrong, but a moderate deal of anthropomorphism can be actually good. And well, I think that in the novel that I analyzed, I think this aim is achieved. So the level of anthropomorphism is moderate, sort of.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in relation to the language of plants and our language about plants and whether plants have language. I think there's one type of language that we have sort of access to or in common with plants, because plants communicate through pheromones or through scent, and this affects us often perhaps subconsciously, but I think some of the figures of thought and patterns of language related to plants stem from a sort of comprehension of their effect on us, even if it's unconscious. So I think that there is an ongoing communication between us and plants, if we pay attention to it, we can perceive it in more subtle ways, perhaps.
I also
I'm sorry, Anja, go on.
Yeah, just briefly, that humans probably can't think without anthropomorphism at all when they think about anything else in the living environment. So I probably start to just, without noticing anthropomorphizing plants around me, to just realize they are there. And I think that probably if you don't do that at all, you wouldn't be able to really connect to anything living, not only plants, but also animals, and just always keep a distance. And it really helps to perceive or to anthropomorphize plants in order to perceive them as individual beings who are living here and not just as kind of a setting. It's just briefly.
One more thing is very briefly. I was also thinking about that in some cases, it also works in the other way around, that like when we use metaphors, when we compare human things to plants, like when you see a family tree, what is that? It's going the other way around. We say something human and use a plant image. So I think it's very interesting that there are cases when it works the other way around. That's it.
Yeah, I was just going to add as well, that anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism are not synonyms. And as part of my research for my chapter, I did read a number of articles by social scientists who were working with children and examining their capacity for empathy with plants. And it seems that some level of anthropomorphism is really required for that to take place. And I think that's at the root of what I was trying to say when I talked about restoration, that we need, that humans need narratives, and I think need anthropomorphized narratives sometimes to help us reimagine and maybe reset our relationship with other beings.
So I suppose there's still a couple of questions here. I saw one question about, and I think it's got quite a simple answer. There's one, Anja, it's a question really to Anja, because there is a question about have you all encountered any texts that depict relationships with overly domesticated plants, for example, GMO wheat, corn, etc. I suppose, your rhubarb plant is an example of that, I would just say.
Yeah, exactly. So this is very much center of the plot in Drizzle, that this is actually set on a rhubarb plant farm, and they actually harvest the rhubarbs. And the interesting thing, of course, is you don't kill a rhubarb plant when you harvest it, you just chuck the leaves and the real rhubarb survives under the soil and will grow out again. But they also have all these practices like putting rhubarb in sheds so that it's dark and it will grow larger. And they've got different specimens and all that. And the interesting thing is that the protagonist never really connects to any of these plants except for that very one who's her friend. So this is a very interesting kind of relationship, because it's kind of reminiscent of these standard discussions you get with animal studies, with this idea of having pets and loving animals, and I'm sitting down at the table and eating animals. And it's basically the same in that story. So she's friends with a rhubarb, but harvests rhubarb. So, but I think this is pretty unique. This is also why I picked this book, even though the author isn't half as well known as the other two, because I haven't come across a book like that again. And still haven't. Yeah,
it's quite unusual. Just looking through the chats, there was a hello from Andrea, who wrote one of our other chapters. Hello, thanks for calling in.
Hello, Andrea.
We love your chapter too. It's nice to have you here. And then we have another question, which is, what are the main overlapping themes you have seen throughout all these chapters? So if any of you have anything to say about that.
I think we already answered half of that in this discussion on anthropomorphism, because this was really a big thing. So whenever humans start representing plants, they apparently start to anthropomorphize them. So I think this is definitely one overlapping theme in the book. And second might be agency, but I mean, my chapter wasn't the agency part, so I don't know how you feel about that. Was agency also so important in your chapters?
Absolutely, yeah.
And perhaps kinships as well, all sorts of kinships.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well.
Like intra-plant, let's say, human plant, plant animal, maybe with matter as well. So I think this is also kind of powerful theme. And maybe the inexplicability as well, sorry, of plant life indeed, right? And plant I don't know, existence. Something that I think all the chapters are kind of trying to grapple with in a way.
Maybe with regard to human-plant relationships, we also included hybridity to some extent, because we have some plants that used to be humans or the other way around. So as another level of plant-human relationships, we have this monstrous.
Just seeing if there's any more questions left, or does any contributors have any questions?
It's just been that activism question coming up in the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, I was wondering to what extent you see critical cultural plant research as activism, and if you do see it as such, how does that shape your work?
Perhaps I'll start just briefly. So obviously not activism in the sense of going onto the street and protesting for something. But I think what we are doing in terms of activism is combating plant blindness. And this is a very, very big thing to do. So I've just been through a seminar with my students, and 2/3 of them didn't even realize that plants are alive when we started that seminar. We're doing English literature, not biology, but you'd assume them to have picked that up sometime in primary school, probably. So there's a long way to go for that. And I think this is the kind of activism we all, in a way, participate in. And it's also definitely necessary, I'd say.
I think that's a thought figure from Western science and philosophy to not think of plants as being alive. So it's not that surprising that that people think that way. But it doesn't mean that it's not necessary what we do. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose, well, you're asking the question about how it shapes our own work now. I'm working on a new book now on plants in mostly Australian literature, and we're having a big focus on Indigenous literature from Australia and Indigenous perspectives on plants. And I think that's important to kind of start to decolonize how we think about the role of plants in our nations, in our countries, in our lives. So, yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, because there's this whole story of colonialism attached to botany as well. So those perspectives are entwined with that very interesting book project that Melanie is engaged in at the moment. I'm looking forward to seeing that book when it comes. Maybe there's another climate-lit webinar, who knows?
And one thing I would also say about activism, and it builds on what Anja was saying, is that what I see, what I'm doing in the conversations I have with people when I talk about my work, is really, transforming how people see plants, and also how they think about their actions. We have these categories, weeds, for example. Well, who's to decide what's a weed? and what do we feel righteous about doing to rid our spaces of weeds? So I think there's an element of activism in making people question their own assumptions and their own choices and actions. I mean, something as simple as do you use pesticides and herbicides?
So there is a tiny question here, if we have time for 1 minute question. What do you want to see more of, less of, in the way children's literature represents human-plant relations?
I would love to see more reference to the interrelatedness of all beings in nature, because it is what I see less. So in children's literature, it is more about finding an individual plant friend or finding a relation to something, but less about the interrelatedness of everything, and also the responsibility that is connected to this interrelatedness.
And I would say that maybe less of this kind of motif of individual human beings saving plants and assuming that if you save one tree, you solve the problem, I don't know, of climate change or, well, ecological problems more broadly. I think we still have a lot of this going on as well. So maybe less of this and maybe more of indeed, as you were saying, when you come of this kind of collectivity, interrelatedness, and also thinking maybe more in terms of agency of, or maybe a kind of an agency that emerges in our encounters, right? We of course have our own agencies. Trees have their own agencies, but then something else emerges in the encounters, and maybe exploring this kind of thing, if it's possible. I'm not a creator, I'm not an author, I can't say, but maybe this would be an interesting way to think about plants. So.
And no, you go ahead.
I'd like to see less of plants as just static, as background, or as never changing. So quite often you really get the idea that even if plants appear as agents in a book, they aren't considered growing and creating babies and communicating with each other. So less of that, and more, of course, of plants that actually do what normal plants do. We often have plants in children's literature that grow, that creep somewhere, but quite often they're monstrous. So the idea of plants doing something apparently is still kind of uncanny or even spooky. And I'd like to see that normalized in a way, that it's not always spooky if a plant does something.
And I'd like to, building on Melanie's project, I'd like to see a broadening of voices in children's literature so that we get stories about plant-human relations that reflect other philosophies than the kind of standard Western scientific hierarchical view.
Excellent. I think we have to stop now. It's an hour, so I'll say goodbye and then I'll pass on to Lykke, and you, because I think I interrupted you about to say something. But from me, thank you, and thank you all for writing your wonderful chapters and working with us. It's been a joy, and this conversation's been a joy as well. So I'll pass on to Lykke now.
I was just going to say about the same thing as you just said. So thanks to everyone for joining the panel and to everyone listening and posting questions. Yeah, and thanks, and have a good rest of the day or night or evening, wherever you are.
Bye.